Hey Defenders, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you guys how we can automate Graylog and MISP so that when I download a malicious file onto my endpoint, Graylog is going to ask MISP if the hash value associated with the file that was just added is known to be malicious. And if it is, we will populate our log as such with our MISP details, all while building a hyperlink to MISP itself so that our SOC analysts can quickly get more details around the specific event. So stick around and we'll jump into it. So for those of you with experience on working with SIEM stacks, you probably are well aware of how difficult it can be managing the wealth of logs coming in. You know, when you first roll out a SIEM stack and start to deploy some agents, your SOC team can maybe handle the amount of logs coming in for a few agents. But once you start to get up to hundreds to thousands of endpoints that you're monitoring, it's very difficult for a SOC team to manually go through all the events to try to pinpoint malicious IPs, malicious file hashes, and gets very mundane and very boring. And no wonder SOC turnover is so high. So in this video, we are actually going to automate that process. And in the last video, which I'll link in the description below, we deployed MISP, which serves as an open source threat intel feed and also has a very robust API. And we're able to invoke this MISP API to essentially pass it a value and say, hey, do you have any events with this value? So this value can be an IP address, a domain, a hash, email, whatever we want to pass it. And we can invoke MISP API via Graylog to then enrich our logs with MISP response. And so that will automate this threat intel lookup for us automatically. So rather than, if I go to my previous example, rather than, as a SOC analyst, maybe I build a filter to view all of the logs where a file was added to the system. If I wanted to take this manually, I would need to scroll down, find the hash value. Let's just grab the SHA-256 after. So I see the file that has been added to the system, which is this icar file. And then I'm going to take the hash, manually go over into MISP. I'll go into search attributes and I'll paste that value within here, run a search, and okay, we see that this hash value is associated with this particular event and is known to be malicious. So rather than having to go through that process every time as a SOC analyst, we're actually going to use Graylog to automate that. We're going to take advantage of MISP API and have Graylog invoke the API when files have been added to the system so that we can now build all of this detail here on the fly before it's written to our Wazuh indexer, and we're not having to manually cross-correlate and try to manually paste everything in. That would just be a nightmare. So the flow of how this is going to work is you guys should already be familiar with how we are collecting the alerts.json file that the Wazuh manager is outputting to and sending that to Graylog. Graylog is then going to invoke MISP API and say, hey, do you have any events with this particular value? And that value is what we are going to define in our pipeline rule. So in this case, I would take the value of my SHA-256 and pass that as part of the API request to MISP. MISP is then going to respond with a yes, I do have an event with this value, and here's the event and its details, or no, and it's just going to respond. It's just going to give us an empty JSON block back. Graylog is then going to take that response and build the raw log before it writes it to OpenSearch. So this is an example of the raw log after the whole process has been done. We've invoked the MISP API, we've done all that, but you'll see, for example, prior to us making the API call to MISP, here we see our event, and notice we don't have our MISP data fields, right? Because we haven't actually implemented this yet. So this is what your event is going to look like now if you're following along. We don't have our MISP data. What this integration is going to do is that now when I make the request and MISP has a hit, we see all of our MISP fields here. So that is essentially the value that we are getting with this integration. And if you stay tuned till the end, I'll show you guys how we can build this hyperlink so then your SOC analyst can quickly view the event itself within MISP. So what we first need to do is create our API key within MISP. So I'm going to go ahead and after logging into MISP, I will go into list auth keys and I'll select add authentication key. I'll do a comment. I'll just say Graylog to MISP. I'll specify an IP address that will be allowed to use this API key. So this is going to be the IP address of my Graylog box. And I will also select the read-only because we don't need to make any, I don't need to use the MISP API to make any administration changes or anything like that. So we'll go ahead and select submit, and I will copy this API key because we will need this later. So I'll go ahead and select, I've noted that down, and let's go ahead and proceed. So prior to working with, prior to integrating Graylog with not only the MISP API, but any APIs in general, I like to first invoke the API so that I can see how the response is going to look back. Because we'll need to tell Graylog when we're configuring our data adapter what fields that we want to actually extract data from that came back as part of the MISP API or whatever API you want to use. So what I'm going to do is copy this curl command, and I will just go onto my Graylog box that I have here. I'm going to paste that in here, and we are going to add our headers of what we're going to accept back, and then the content type that we are passing. I will then add my authorization header, and I'm going to change this to the API key that we just created. I'm then going to set my URL. So I am just using HTTP in this demo. Any production environment, of course, recommend HTTPS, but I was just lazy and didn't want to configure it on my end. So I'm going to point to my where my MISP box is listening. So misp.stockfortress.co. And then here is the API endpoint that we are going to trigger. So we're going to call /attributes /red search /value, and then we are going to pass in just our test value. So this is a value that's going to exist within MISP. So if I go into search attributes, if I paste this .onion domain there, you'll see that we get this event back with that value that we just passed. So when I make this API request, we should get, and MISP is going to respond to us with a positive hit, and it will be contained within event ID 4. So I will go ahead and paste that. Okay, cool. We got our JSON response back. I always like to use an online JSON part when trying to read through responses that you're getting back, just because it's much easier on the eyes. And here we see exactly as we expect. So we see MISP is responding with the event that contains our .onion value that we have here. So we see it's contained within event ID 4. If we go back to the UI here, we see event ID 4, and then we see the .onion value that we just passed. So that's looking good. So we know our API key works. We know that from the Graylog box, we're able to connect to MISP. We can now start to build out this configuration within Graylog. So similarly, as we did with part 8, where we integrated Graylog with Gray Noise, we are going to do very similar steps. So we are going to create a data adapter. We're going to create our cache. We're going to create our lookup table, and then we'll create our pipeline rule, which will then instruct Graylog when it's going to invoke. It's going to tell Graylog when is it going to invoke the MISP API. So I'll hop back onto my Graylog box. I will go into system, and I will select lookup tables, and I'll first select my data adapters here, and we'll go ahead and create a new data adapter, and we're going to select our HTTP JSON path. I will then give it a title. I'll just call it MISP. You can give it a description if you want. We then need to configure our lookup URL, and this is going to be our MISP endpoint, which in my case is going to be this guy here. So I'll copy all the way up until my value, and then up to my value with a colon there. And we also need to add the key variable. So if you read off to the side here, you'll see that this is what Graylog will substitute with whatever field was contained within the log itself, like so. So in our instance, if we go back to our example, the key that would get replaced would be this value here. So I'll just copy and paste that there so you guys can visualize it. So once Graylog builds this, builds the full URL as part of the pipeline rule, it's going to replace our key variable with the actual value that's contained within the log. We're then going to build our single value JSON path and then our multi-value JSON path. And this correlates to the response of the API request. So if we go into our JSON decoder, we see how the JSON data structure is built is we have response, and then we have attribute, which is going to be a list, and then we have our various fields here. So what we can do is tell Graylog, like say for example, I only want to grab the category. I could tell Graylog to grab that by going response, attribute. We're selecting the first element within our JSON list, and then we are selecting the category field. So if we go back here, we follow response, we follow attribute. We're saying because this is a list here, right? I'll specify a 0 because I'm saying I just want to view the first one in the list. And then we are grabbing the dot category field, which correlates to what we have here. So what I would get back as part of my JSON response would be network activity. So that handles the single value. Let's also do the multi-value, which I will correlate there like so. So now this multi-value JSON response will get everything within the list. So that will grab all of these fields here. All right, and I'm gonna go ahead and add my headers. So we have the accept. Let me just go back to my curl and I can just copy these. So these are all the headers that Graylog is going to send as part of the request to MISP. So go ahead and add and create that adapter. And to verify that this is working, I'll go into the adapter that we just created, and I will go ahead and test our lookup. So I'll go ahead and just paste our .onion example that we tried a second ago, select lookup, and now we get our response back. So that's looking good. So we get our single value response, right? So how I was saying the response.attribute first element within the list, and then dot category is our single value, which we see here. So if we go back, we again see that the category was network activity. And then the multi-value response, we see all of the data that follows under attribute. So we see all these guys here. So we're getting exactly what we expected. Now let's go ahead and create our cache, which I covered in part 8. So I'm not going to cover all that now. I'll just select that there. And then I will do the same for my lookup table. And I'm going to call this MISP query. And I'm going to link my data adapter that we created and then our cache that we created as well. So one thing to note, if you're not following this name exactly, then you will need to change that within the pipeline rule that we are about to create here in a second. So just take note of that going forward. So I'll go ahead and create our lookup table. And okay, so we have now configured Graylog with what to do when it's instructed to invoke the MISP API. Now we need to tell Graylog when is it actually going to invoke this API. And for that, we are going to go ahead and create a pipeline rule. So I'll go into system pipelines. I will select manage rules, and let's go ahead and create a new rule, which is configured here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy what's in the post here, and I will paste that there, and I'll just add that to the description. So what we're doing is now telling Graylog when to invoke this API. So we have first we have 3 conditions. In this demo, we're only doing it for files that have been added to the system. So for us to tell Graylog when we get a log from Wazuh, when a file has been added to the system, there's a few conditions. Our rule.group1 must be equal to OSEC. So if we go back to our log, we see our rule group 1 is equal to OSEC. Rule group 2 is going to have to be equal to syscheck. So good. And lastly, our syscheck event needs to be added. So we know that this is a file has been added to the system and not deleted or not modified. So we're only going to invoke this when a file has been added. So these 3 conditions must be true in order for Graylog to invoke the MISP API. What we're then going to do is tell Graylog what lookup table we're going to use, which is our MISP query. Your lookup table name needs to be exact. If you deferred from what I use, MISP_query, then you're going to need to reflect that there. We are then going to tell Graylog, okay, what field value do we want to use to build our key, right? So how we built our URL, we assigned our key variable. Well, this is what's telling Graylog to substitute for that key variable. So in this case, we're going to check the syscheck. We're going to take the value that's stored within our syscheck underscore SHA-256 underscore after field. So if I go back to my event here we see our field name. And so Graylog is going to grab this value, and that's what it's going to build as part of the URL that it sends to MISP as part of the API request. So I'll go ahead and apply. I will save and close. And now we've created the rule. Let's actually add it to our pipeline. So I already have my Wazuh logs forwarding to my GeoIP pipeline that we did in a few videos back where we talked about the log normalization. I have that example at stage 0 here. What I'm actually going to do is create another stage that will handle our threat intel enrichment. So I'll go ahead and select add new stage. We'll say stage 1. We will leave it at the default of at least one of the rules of the stage matches the message. And I will select our new pipeline rule that we created. I'll select save, and that looks good. One thing to note, your stage 0, if you are following along, is probably left at the default of at least one of the rules. If you haven't done more log normalization than what we've covered, make sure you change that to none or more, or else Graylog is not actually going to progress that log onto stage 1 to actually do the MISP API lookup. And all right, so I think we have everything in place now. So let's actually test this guy out. So let me just select the last 5 minutes. And so now on my Windows endpoint, let's actually download a malicious file. So this is just an iCar test file. So if I download this file, and then if I check in my downloads, we see the file has been downloaded. So the file has been added to the system. Now, if we look within Grafana, we see our Wazuh rule for file added to the system. If we scroll down, now we start to see our MISP meta details field. And here we see our file that we just downloaded, of course. So we know, so now as a SOC analyst, I know, okay, this file on this endpoint has a known malicious hash within MISP. And we can get the MISP events that we see here. And what we can also do is build out a hyperlink and actually view the event within MISP itself. So now I can coordinate with maybe, okay, now I want to check if network connections out to any of these IP addresses have been observed from any endpoint. So I can now start to dig in a little further. And let's actually go ahead and build this, because I haven't actually showed you guys how to build that yet. So I'm going to go into data sources, and I'll select my Wazuh data source, and I'll scroll down to the bottom, and we will go ahead and build the data link. So what you'll need to do is just replace your MISP domain accordingly. So you would just replace the misp.stockfortress.co, and you will build the field name that'll need to match in within Grafana. So that correlates to what we have here. And so what Grafana is going to do is take the value that's pertained within this field. So in this case, it would be 16, and it's going to build our URL like so. So it would be like this. So now I can just directly, and it builds a little hyperlink for us so that we can directly open this event within MISP. And it doesn't stop here. What I haven't touched on is domains, IP addresses, maybe emails if you're stripping that out. And this same logic can be applied for all of those. You would just need to tweak your Graylog pipeline rule to match on those specific conditions of whatever it is you want to enrich. So it's a really awesome feature to add to your SIEM stack. Automating your threat intel lookups is crucial because there is no way you can manually cipher through everything to try pick out malicious events. And it doesn't stop there. You can take advantage of other APIs. You don't have to just take advantage of MISP, and Graylog has the flexibility to do that. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one.